Hello students, this is Professor McDonald, and this particular PowerPoint slide will be one that is narrated, where I will go through the slides and provide information to further expand on the information that's contained in the slides. I hope you find this beneficial as an additional tool that you can use as you study the course content and prepare for exams as well. First, let's look at our, and one thing you need to do is, as you finish, as my narration stops, then you will just proceed to the next slide and the narration will continue. Let's go to our second slide, which is Chapter 1. And this is a listing of, brief listing of the objectives. In this particular chapter, we'll explain exactly what intelligence means, define what is actionable intelligence, describe the purpose of what and why the United States needs intelligence, explain how intelligence impacts national security, describe the real world of the intelligence professional, explain the term decision advantage and how it can be achieved, and describe the different levels of intelligence, different types of intelligence, and the 5 functions of intelligence. And when we get into the functions, we'll briefly provide an overview in this chapter, but we'll get into each one in much more detail as we progress in the course. Next slide. I like to put this slide in. The question is good spy or bad spy, and there's a couple of film links that are very short film clips I want you to look at. I had to put Sean Connery in because he was my James Bond when I was your age, and of course Daniel Craig is the much more contemporary James Bond. And the question is, are these good spies or bad spies? I'll let you make your own decision after you view the clips, but just remember, in the field of espionage, of spies, gathering information, gathering intelligence, the intelligence professional is not a person that wants to create a lot of focus on themselves. And so you'll, after you watch the film clips, you make a decision yourself as to whether or not you think these gentlemen are good spies or bad spies. And of course, this is Hollywood's spin on a very popular set of books that was, the original author was Ian Fleming. Next. Our key terms: define intelligence, decision advantage, types of intelligence. I've already covered these briefly in the objectives. Also, what's the difference between the roles of the CIA and the KGB? Is intelligence an absolute truth? Is all information intelligence? Who does intelligence serve? And do we need a wall between the policymaker and the intelligence analyst? I really like this quote by Napoleon in this particular slide. I would give 1,000 foot soldiers for one good spy. And that tells a lot about the advantage of having actionable intelligence, planning, knowledge. We'll even talk about it again in Chapter 2. But the key term, and they talk about it in our text, is decision advantage. That is what intelligence is for. It's for policymakers. It's for leaders. It could be for a detective or an FBI agent that's in the field working. It gives them knowledge of quantitative and many times qualitative factors that they have to consider in their decision making. Let's be honest. Think about it in a sports context. If you're a coach for a football team, if you know what play the other team is going to call, can you not set your defense up? Does that not give you a decision advantage as to how to counteract what they're doing? So just think about intelligence in that nature. That decision advantage, it's designed to help that policymaker or that decision maker make good quality decisions based on the situation that they face. And again, he would give 1,000 foot soldiers for one good spy. That's that pre-planning, that foreknowledge. Purposes of intelligence: know the capabilities of our adversary. What are the intentions? Obviously, when you gather information, on an adversary based on the intelligence that you can acquire. It helps you determine, at least forecast, what you think their intentions are. For example, if we're watching the Russians and all of a sudden we see a buildup of military, of weapon capability on a particular border, maybe it could be the Ukraine where there's been a lot of turmoil lately, then does that not tell us that maybe their intention is, number one, either to move into Ukraine or to strengthen that border to further antagonize the situation? And what impact will their intentions have on our own national goals? That's when we think about intelligence at a national policy level. In this slide we have a picture of George Washington. In the quote itself, "As it is of great consequence to gain intelligence of the enemy's intended operations, I cannot but recommend your attention to this subject, and that you will insert some measure for establishing a channel of information." Washington had a great appreciation for the value of intelligence operations. He used them masterfully during the Revolutionary War. Here was a man that was put in charge of an army that was nowhere as well trained, as well supplied logistically as the British at that time, which were at the time was the #1 army in the world, and they had the best navy in the world. And so he was faced with this great challenge, and he knew that he needed information, he needed intelligence to help him plan his moves and allow his soldiers to survive long enough until they could build up a capability where they could provide a better accounting of themselves when facing the British. And he did it quite well. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the next chapter. And of course, they established the Culper Ring. You had a Sergeant Bissell. They talk about it in the textbook, who was an undercover spy in the British Army. Here we go. We're putting people undercover. So Washington did see the value. It's always important to define our terms, and I've got a few definitions here. One from the FBI, information that has been analyzed and refined, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, so that is useful to policymakers in making decisions, specifically decisions about potential threats to our national security. Mark Lowenthal, who is a renowned expert on intelligence and intelligence studies, he goes into much more detail. Intelligence is the process by which specific types of information important to national security are requested, collected, analyzed, and provided to policymakers. The products of that process, the safeguarding of these processes and this information by counterintelligence activities, and the carrying out of operations as requested by lawful authorities. So that's a much more complex, which addresses many of the functions that we'll talk about later. But again, these are different definitions, different agencies. Defense Department has their own. Let's look at another one. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is our #1 spy agency relative to international. Their realm is in the international world. They do not have venue or jurisdiction to collect information and develop intelligence domestically within the United States. That's the job of the FBI. The CIA's responsibility is outside in the international domain. And they define intelligence as knowledge and foreknowledge of the world around us, the prelude to decision and action by U.S. policymakers. So in other words, we develop intelligence so policymakers and leaders can make decisions, informed decisions on how they want to react to certain situations. And then the question at the bottom, what is actionable intelligence? That's very critical. It's not going to do you any good as an agency if you develop intelligence that you really can't use. It's not actionable. So that's what they're talking about, being able to actually take it and use it. Let me give you an example here of how intelligence can be actionable. Let's say I go and I conduct a search warrant, and at that search warrant I find an address book. Well, the address book itself, and maybe the suspect's a known drug dealer. Well, the address book itself is just information. I mean, it might have names, phone numbers, contact numbers, or whatever. At that point, it's information only. It's not intelligence, so to speak. That information has to go through a process, and in that process, maybe matching up the telephone numbers with other known drug agents or drug dealers, maybe matching up the addresses, the names, or whatever. When you start going through that process, you take information to the point of intelligence, and we'll talk about that again. And then if I can take that information and actually use it and maybe get another search warrant, or maybe put together a conspiracy case connecting these individuals involved in this drug ring, now I've got actionable intelligence. Just an example. And again, this is a good definition, I think. Intelligence, and this is the key right here. Intelligence is a process using information from all sources and focused externally outside your organization, designed to reduce the level of uncertainty for a decision maker. I ask a question at the bottom. Should intelligence professionals be involved in policy decisions? What do you think? Well, just think about it. If you want objective information coming to you as a decision maker, then there shouldn't be influence that crosses over between the professional and the policymaker. No, the individual that's involved in the intelligence agency or intelligence community, he should be objective. He should be devoid of having the responsibility to make policy decisions, because if that's the case, then he's just going to tell his boss what he wants to hear. We want our intelligence analysts, our professionals, to operate independently and call it like it is. And so therefore, they should not be involved in policy decisions, because they can be corrupted in their deliberations and their analysis of the information that's provided. This is a good slide because it separates it differentiates between information versus intelligence. Information could be scattered bits of data that's unrefined, raw, and unfinished. In other words, what I described to you a little bit ago, I go in on a search warrant and I find an address book. Well, it's bits of data, names, telephone numbers. But if I take that information and I analyze it, maybe I take the names in that address book and I run them through criminal history checks, and I determine that these people are known drug dealers, they've been arrested before, and I can show connections with phone numbers or whatever. Now I've evaluated, I've filtered, I've analyzed that information, and then I can put out a product, which would be intelligence, to help the investigators determine what step to take, a basis for action. Is all information equal and valuable? No, it's not. Some information you get, you're going to find as you vet that information, evaluate it, that it is not as reliable as other information. Now there's different types of intelligence, and let's talk about that a little bit. And just to kind of backtrack a little bit, sometimes intelligence, before I talk about tactical intelligence, sometimes policymakers want to make moves strictly on raw information. That they want to react quickly, and that is not always a good thing. Now there's times when that could be all that you can provide. For example, you're at the courthouse and you get a phone call, an anonymous phone call, and somebody says a bomb is going to explode in the courthouse in 30 minutes. Well, that's the information that you have, and that policymaker, the person in charge of that courthouse, has got to make an informed decision. Is he going to evacuate that building or whatever within that short time span? So those things can happen. Now going back to our types of intelligence, our tactical is our lower level. And it would be, as they say here, assess criminal activity relevant to a precinct within a city. Criminal activity. Let me give you another example. Let's say, and they also, in the slide, they talk about collecting and providing tactical intelligence. Let me just give you a better example here. If I'm a criminal investigator and I'm going to execute a search warrant on an individual's house, what type of tactical intelligence do I need? I need to know where they live. I need to know the reputation of this individual. Is this somebody that's known to have firearms? When I look at the house, I need to know what's the best way to get in and out of the house. I need to know, hey, does this guy got dogs outside of his house? This would be tactical information that would be pushed down. On a military level, let's say you have a lieutenant that's going to go out on a reconnaissance mission. He needs to know what the terrain is like. He needs to know have other missions, other patrols had problems in that area. Can they expect resistance if they get detected? That sort of thing. So this would be tactical intelligence. It's pushed down to the lower levels and used, and the users could be a precinct commander, it could be a detective, could be a special agent, whatever, or a lieutenant. Then we have strategic intelligence. And strategic intelligence addresses the big picture, deals with questions of mission, goals, objectives, programs, and resource planning. Focuses on emergent problems, continuing problems, risk and threat assessment, executive level. I'll give you an example. Strategic intelligence would be something like, what is the influence today of the Islamic State throughout the world? Let's say the president is going to a meeting with the Prime Minister of Great Britain and France, and they're going to discuss the war on terror, and in particular the growing influence of the Islamic State and the threat they possess. He would issue a requirement to the director of the CIA and say, I need an update. I need a strategic intelligence report on where we are today relative to our predictions and our forecasting of the influence of the Islamic State. And so that would be a strategic level product that the CIA would produce to him that would be more of a global overview of the strengths, the influence of that terrorist organization called the Islamic State. So now we're looking at a big picture. If you look at World War II, a strategic intelligence would be addressing the German army. What are they doing on the Russian front? What are they doing in France, in Germany before D-Day? Okay? So these are strategic level decisions that intelligence provides. And then operational kind of bridges the gap between the two, strategic and tactical, supports ongoing operations and investigations, plans and tasks, tactical activities, multiple targets. In other words, you could have a multi-jurisdiction group or agencies working together targeting, let's say, for example, methamphetamine problems in North Carolina. So you have DEA, you might have postal inspectors, you could have local and state law enforcement working in a joint operation, looking over multiple jurisdictions and targeting, say, a major importation of methamphetamine and the manufacture it within North Carolina and South Carolina. And so any intelligence on multiple groups, multiple targets gathered together would be something like operational intelligence. This also could be looking at terrorism. Let's say there's suspected sleeper cells operating within sleeper cells of the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda operating within North and South Carolina. And you have multiple agencies, the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, working on these problems together within this specific geographical area. At the military level, it would be more of a battalion level, expeditionary force level operation. So there's our three: tactical, lowest level; operational, kind of in the middle; and strategic, the big picture. And these are just, in this particular slide, just some examples that I'm going to give you on what an intelligence product would look like after analysis has been done. We have a telephone chart, and you have maybe your target is in the center, and Maybe it's a drug operation, and all those phone numbers, depending on the color codes or whatever, are people that have called to this individual, or you've been able to track, and you can establish a conspiracy based on looking at who these people are contacting, how many times they call them, incoming, outgoing. We have software today that can take thousands of phone calls and put together a chart like this in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes with a skilled operator. Or you can have something like, in this particular case, we have the Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel in Mexico. This would be a graphical representation based on intelligence, where they have drawn connections between individuals and identified individuals within that cartel. This is the type of product that you would provide when you're trying to put together a conspiracy prosecution of individuals involved in this type of activity. And we'll get into more of this later on in the semester. And another way to break it down, intelligence, is domestic versus foreign. And when we're talking about foreign, we're talking about intelligence is focused on international, at the international level, and domestic would be here within the United States and its territories. From a jurisdictional perspective, the FBI has primary jurisdiction of counterterrorism activities and espionage activities within the United States. The CIA is a pure intelligence agency that their responsibility would be internationally and foreign. So if you went to a place like Nigeria, which is having a lot of problems today with Boko Haram, a notorious terrorist organization in Nigeria, you would have CIA officers that are working in Nigeria with the locals, etc., trying to establish and develop intelligence on that terrorist group. Now, I will say this, the FBI and other federal agencies do have attachés in different foreign embassies overseas, because I've run into them in my own travels over there. And their job is to coordinate international type investigations. And it could be terrorism investigations, it could be international organized crime investigations. So they have a presence over there, but the FBI's primary responsibility, of course, is here domestically within the United States, and organizations like the CIA are overseas. And then you have the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the Department of Defense, and they operate primarily looking at overseas or international, developing international information and developing intelligence on the military capabilities of not only our allies but our adversaries overseas. This is a slide that just shows the, quote, 17 agencies. You'll actually have 16 members, and now we have I'll talk about this in another chapter. Since 9/11, we've established in the United States the Office of Director of National Intelligence, or the DNI, and his job is to coordinate the activities of these other 16 major intelligence agencies. He's a coordinator. Each one of these circles represents a different agency. Obviously all the militaries are represented, along with like the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, NSA, and the other groups here. And we will get into these in more detail in another chapter, but just a quick overview slide of the intelligence community itself. What we learned was the coordination and the sharing of information prior to 9/11 was not very productive, not very good. A lot of it was turf battles between organizations, and what we learned from 9/11 was that we need to share if we're going to be effective. And so that's one of the reasons why we have much more coordination and sharing of information since the 9/11 attacks. Functions of intelligence. Now, one of the things that we are going to learn is, and we'll have a whole chapter primarily on these functions. We'll get into a much more detail. These are mostly just an introduction to you on what the various functions are. Let's start with collection, and with collection you get into what we call the INTs, and we'll get into that in much more detail. But HUMINT, That's human intelligence. That's where we're actually out there recruiting assets overseas, trying to develop information, sources of information that we can use, or individuals that can give us information that can be analyzed in our intelligence efforts. We also have signal intelligence, and what we're talking about there would be something like intercepting cell phone messages, or excuse me, cell phone, telephone calls, intercepting email communications. These are signals that either go through the air or through wires, and so signal intelligence is another one that they talk about in the book. And like I said, we'll get into much more detail of the various intelligence collection capabilities that we have. Interestingly, the most expensive of our functions is collection, if you can imagine. Think about our satellites, think about the cost of developing human sources overseas, think about signal intelligence. We'll talk about measures and signal intelligence relative to radiation, things of that nature, a little later on. And the various agencies have specialties in this. Now, collection and is also considered to be the heart, because without collecting that information, we would there wouldn't be anything to analyze. A next function is analysis itself, and this is where we get into connecting the dots. This is where we have professional analysts who are working at the various intelligence agencies. These are highly trained individuals. These are great jobs. I just had a student, one of my former students, that's actually has taken this class in a lecture format. He was in the minor in terrorism studies. He just landed a great job as a counterintelligence analyst with the Department of Navy, a civilian job up in the D.C. area. But in analysis, this is where the work is performed relative to connecting the dots, taking the information and try to determine what does it mean, forecasting what's going to happen. Intelligence is not a specific science. It's not something we guarantee this is going to happen. The word is more we predict, we forecast these things will happen, and it's only as good as the information, the recentness of the information, and the continued validation of information that comes in before it's worked. And again, connecting the dots, because information is often ambiguous. It's of question reliability. One of the problems is the volume of it. You can have too much information, and I've seen that myself when I was working in the field. And so that's why this is a very, very critical aspect or function of intelligence agencies. Another function is counterintelligence, and that's the protection of information and intelligence. I mean, we're out there trying to collect information from our adversaries overseas. Well, they're also trying to collect from us, so we're trying to protect what we have. And so that's where our counterintelligence comes into play. And there's many ways that this can be accomplished. We can classify information based on its sensitivity and potential harm, and that's when you hear about terms like confidential, top secret, secret. We talk about access to classified information. I know myself, if you're a federal agent like I was, you have to have a top secret clearance. Okay, so there's information that I was given access to, and it was based on a need to know. And so that's very critical that we do not just haphazardly have information out there of a classified nature that could impact our national security, where anybody can access it. We don't want that to happen, so that's a very critical part of the overall function of intelligence agencies with counterintelligence. So there's a defensive aspect of it, and that's the protection of information, the classification of information. People that have top secret clearances have to go through background investigations. I used to do these for some of the agencies that we'll actually address in this book, and that's going out and interviewing people, checking out on their what type of person that person is before they make a decision, a hiring decision. And all of you will go through this. Additionally, drug testing, polygraph exams, these are all part of defensive measures in counterintelligence. And also there's an offensive aspect, and that's going out there trying to develop individuals that will provide this information, okay? Going out recruiting sources of information to collect. We're being on the offense. We're trying to get these folks, or we're trying to, number one, trying to recruit people, but we're also trying to identify those people that maybe work for the United States government who are double agents, who are also providing information to our adversaries. And two of the most famous American spies are Robert Hansen, who was an FBI agent, and Aldrich Ames. And actually, I think I have a clip of Mr. Ames, a short film clip that you'll review this week, talking about the damage that he did. He did terrible damage to the United States. Both him and Hansen were both selling secrets to the Soviet Union. And Ames, during his time period, I mean, for example, we had some very, very good assets, people that had been recruited by the CIA that worked in the Soviet Union. Some of them were, one of them was a high-level military officer, and Ames turned their names over to the Soviet agents, and all of a sudden these people started disappearing. And so this is the type of this is an offensive aspect of counterintelligence. Would be for the FBI to go out and see if we can identify people like Ames and Hansen that are working for us that are actually spying as well. So we want to uncover our own spies, but we also want to get foreign officers to tell us what to do. And this is all part of the counterintelligence, and we'll spend a whole chapter on this later on in the semester. We also have covert operations. And with covert operations, these are things where we don't want it to be able, these are actions that we take that we don't want to be traced back to the U.S. Covert means secret, okay, to the U.S. government. They always use that term plausible deniability, and that's one thing that we want to try to acquire when we're involved in covert operations is, hey, if these people get found out, we don't want them to be able to trace it back to us. The Bay of Pigs operation, which they talk about in the textbook, was a covert operation. Operation Neptune Spear, which was the operation run by the SEAL team, along with other agencies. The CIA actually developed the original information that led to the identification of the location and whereabouts of Osama bin Laden. These are covert operations. And finally, intelligence agencies engage in intelligence management. And this is organizing and processing the amount of data that arrive daily, maintaining the libraries of information. They also have to protect that information. And so it's important to understand that these are the major functions, and it is important, and we will spend much more considerable time. This is just a very quick overview in this chapter of the functions of intelligence. And don't forget to look up what bottom line up front means. And remember, good intelligence begins with the decision makers clearly identifying their concerns and needs. In other words, intelligence analysts aren't sitting around making up, well, what do we need to study? That's not the way it works. As we get into the intelligence cycle, you'll learn that. But intelligence analyst and the intelligence community reacts to the requirements that are placed on them by leadership. And that'll end. That ends chapter 1, and then we'll move into chapter 2. When we deal with a little bit of the history of intelligence in the United States. Okay, for Chapter 2, let's take a quick look at our learning objectives. Explain why the United States did not develop a robust, sustained intelligence capability until the 20th century. Trace the history of early American intelligence efforts from the Revolutionary War until World War II. Explain how the strategic surprise of Pearl Harbor convinced the United States that it needed to enhance its intelligence capabilities, and describe how the Cold War was a war of intelligence and how it shaped the development of American intelligence agencies. Explain how intelligence failures, such as the excesses of COINTELPRO and Operation Chaos and the spy scandals of the 1980s, affected intelligence efforts. Identify some reasons why the United States was not able to anticipate and thwart the attacks of September 11th. Identify the members of the intelligence community, and we'll discuss briefly the Ames and Hansen cases. When we look at the history of intelligence, did Washington use intelligence? I've already explained that previously. Yes, he did. But the U.S. intelligence really is relatively young. We did not always have an active intelligence capability. Why not? Some of it was a couple of reasons. Some of it was the United States was essentially formed when we broke away from the British. One of the reasons was the distrust of government, and the British had really abused the colonists prior to the Declaration of Independence through various means, and most of you know that through your history classes that you've taken. And therefore, there's a strong emphasis in this country about separation of powers, individual rights, the rights of the individual, etc. So, and intelligence itself is not, a lot of people aren't comfortable with it, because a lot of when you're dealing with intelligence and intelligence activities, you're talking about secret operations. And this is something that kind of goes counter to the American way of doing things. So that's one of the reasons why the United States did not rush into developing strong intelligence capabilities. And of course the threat. Today now we're in a much more global world where it's very easy to travel from country to country, and the world's not as big as it used to be, and geography protected us quite a bit because of our separation from the other continents. But, you know, in the Revolution they had the Secret Committee and the Committee of Secret Correspondence, so Washington did see the value of it. We even had Nathan Hale. You've all heard that statement. I regret I have one life to lose for my country. So Washington did see the value of it, but ultimately, when the war was over, he did not. It was done mostly in the United States on piecemeal basis. If something came up like the War of 1812, they would ratchet up their capabilities, but then it wasn't a permanent. There wasn't a permanent establishment of intelligence capability here in the United States. And of course, like I said, the world's much larger today. And there's one thing you need to do if you're not familiar with geography very well, is make sure you know what's going on in the world. How can you really understand the Middle East if you don't know where it's at on a map? And you don't understand the culture change, the differences, the way of life of these places where terrorism, for example, is very predominant and prevalent. Famous spy, Nathan Hale. I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country, and his statue is there at CIA headquarters. I've had one trip there. I did an interview there once on a background investigation. It's a very impressive building. It's outside of D.C. in Langley, Virginia, and a very sought-after job. If you can ever land a job with the CIA, I think that'd be a real feather in your cap, because it's a very high-quality organization, intelligence agency. Now, when I say intelligence agency, yes, their primary responsibility, but they also have some paramilitary operations they carry on. We saw that in post 9/11 in Afghanistan, and also the CIA is involved in drone strikes, places like Yemen, overseas. From the Civil War, let's jump ahead here. From the Civil War to World War I, yeah, the North and the South used spies. If you looked at that introductory slideshow that I gave you, we had Harriet Tubman with the Black Dispatches. She was providing intelligence information to the North during the Civil War. We saw the development of the Pinkerton Detective Agency during the Civil War. And when the Civil War ended, again, there was no permanent capability established. The first military organization was the Office of Naval Intelligence, and that was established in 1882, whose primary mission was to help modernize U.S. forces by learning the secrets. So the military was starting to develop a intelligence capability. The Army followed with that soon. When I was an NCIS agent, we were actually underneath the Office of Naval Intelligence. That was our parent organization. As World War I ended, we also had the development of anarchists. And anarchy, of course, is destruction for no real purpose. Here in the United States, in the book they talk about, and a lot of these were workers from around the world who had come to the United States. Many of them were inspired by the Russian Revolution, and they were opposed to capitalism, wealthy business owners, and many of them were immigrants that had come into this country. They weren't citizens, and believe it or not, during that time there were a lot of bombings. These radical anarchists began a series of bombings that targeted government authorities and businesses here in the United States. And as a result, there was a small organization at that time called the Bureau of Investigation, which essentially became the forerunner of the FBI. And so, as you read in the text, they talk about the Palmer raids, etc. And then there's a photograph in this particular slide about the Confederate spy Belle Boyd. So there was active spying in the Civil War. At the end of the war, you start to see the military develop some more capabilities. On this particular slide, you just get an idea of how technology has changed a little bit. And at the Civil War, you see the development of balloons to go up in the air and obviously do surveillance and observation over the battlefield. Actually, Lincoln was a big proponent of this, and some of his generals were a little resistant to use this technology, but he obviously prevailed, and they were very useful information that was developed, using the balloons. And of course, if we just look at why have intelligence agencies, is again to avoid that strategic surprise. There's a good picture of the Arizona sinking at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked Hawaii. And again, we're supporting our policy process and to maintain secrecy of our information, our needs, and our methods. So that's one of the key things to remember. Post-World War I, we now see the U.S. identified the need to enhance its intelligence capabilities with the development of new technologies, transcontinental cables, where foreign governments could send signals through these cables. The Black Chamber, which is mentioned in our textbook, their job was to decrypt intercepted messages of foreign governments and decipher those messages. And obviously, if you know what your adversary is going to do, that intelligence is critical to being able to react what they're going to do in protecting your own national security. We saw, as with the telephone lines, etc., their development in a post-World War I era. We see the function of signal intelligence developing as a collection method, as a key collection method, which still stands today. Now, President Roosevelt, was reluctant to pursue monitoring it, and his reluctance ultimately turned out to be disastrous, because the Japanese code was not broken. Had it been broken prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, perhaps that attack could have been prevented, or at least not as many of our military resources would have been in the harbor that day when the attack occurred. And the deciphering and the analysis, this is where you see the development of cryptology or cryptoanalysis. And if you want to just try your hand, don't look at the bottom of this slide here. This is a little crypto exercise I do in the lecture classes, and you can just follow the instructions that are provided and the method in which this cryptology was performed. Again, don't look at the bottom, and see if you can decrypt the message with the code which is listed at the bottom. This is just a repeat of the prior slide showing the solution. Of course, in World War II, obviously now we're another world war. There's obviously a need that develops. A coordinator of information was created, and this was to stimulate agency cooperation between military and the civilian side, between military agencies. Obviously, it was needed, that coordination. You see the development of an interesting organization called the Office of Strategic Services. This ultimately developed into what we later knew as the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. And of course, their focus of OSS was to operate overseas, provide training to guerrilla movements, underground movements, going in, working with the French resistance and other resistance military, civilian military personnel that existed in countries that were either occupied by the Germans or in countries that were occupied by the Japanese, to try to develop that resistance movement, which is another front really that the Germans and the Japanese had to deal with, in addition to the Allied forces. So this all goes into play. I guess if you looked at it today, it would be like the CIA going in and using paramilitary operations to try to track terrorists or whatever. And also you could have the CIA going in and trying to spread disinformation to try to subvert a regime that's not friendly to the United States. So you see the Office of Strategic Services. I have a film that I posted also on Blackboard. If this interests you, it's optional reviewing, but it does give you a really nice history on the on OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And of course, this organization was disbanded at the end of the war. But ultimately, as we'll see in the history, we'll see the National Security Act, which eventually will establish the CIA. On the home front, you have the FBI that's actively involved in trying to detect spies that are operating in this country. And this included here on the home front domestically, and also FBI agents working in Central and South America, where the Germans had a strong presence. And of course, what we're looking for is Nazi spies, saboteurs, etc. In our textbook, there's a good explanation of some of the work that they did do, which was excellent work, and a lot of arrests were made, and spies that were and plans that the Germans had and try to sabotage things in the United States, where the FBI had been successful in deterring those operations. You also have the decoding of by our cryptologist of the codes, and they were able to not only decode the German code, but also the Japanese code, which obviously was very beneficial to our generals as they're planning operations. So you see the real development of history as it moves forward. One of the things I want you to read about is called Project Verona, which monitored Soviet communications until 1980. It's very interesting in the fact that information developed in this project was later revealed to confirm that the Rosenbergs, who we'll talk about in another slide, were actually guilty of espionage. And of course, after World War II, you see the development of the Cold War. This is the two major superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union on the other side. And if you look at this particular map that I have here, it'll show what areas were the United States and their influence. We would call our democratic areas, and then you have in red those countries that were under the domination and influence of the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain was a term, I believe it was termed it was used by Winston Churchill to show that curtain between the East and the West, the East being the Russians and the West being the Allies, the United States, Great Britain, etc. The Rosenbergs, in this particular slide, there's also a short film clip I want you to watch. They were suspected of passing military atomic secrets to the Soviets. A lot of people at the time thought they were railroaded, but as the textbook will tell you, Project Verona, which had classified information and that wasn't revealed for many years later after Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed, was that they were actually committing espionage. What they were doing was selling atomic secrets to the Soviets, which allowed the Soviets then to develop nuclear weapon capability. A very strong breach, and obviously a threat to the United States. The Cold War, I've mentioned it briefly, United States versus Soviet Union. We had the Iron Curtain, philosophy of containment. Our philosophy was if we can contain them where they are as they try to expand into different areas with it throughout the world, not obviously to engage in war, but to try to contain their influence. That's where you get some of the things like one of the terms they used to use was the domino effect. If this country falls, then the country next to it will fall under the influence of the Soviet Union. So again, we used a philosophy, if you will, of containment. Let's try to contain their influence throughout the world. And of course, intelligence played a big part in trying to develop information on where they were trying to expand their influence and what could we do in those countries that were on the brink of going either in favor of the West or the East. They call it mutually assured destruction military strategy, a deterrent in the sense that both of us have got such powerful nuclear weapons that if there's ever a war, then all we'll end up doing is destroying each other. And so that was a very strong deterrence. And then as something I've already mentioned before, the early days of the CIA, you see the National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA and the NSC, which is the National Security Council. And of course, at the time, the CIA was very active in this time period during the Cold War in countering Soviet influence and the spread of communism throughout the world. And the book talks about several places where they were actively involved, and so make sure you review that. At times, the CIA was also criticized for some of their influence that was, which seemed on the front end to be very beneficial to the United States, but later maybe one way to look at it is in the long term it was very detrimental. And they talk about their influence in a coup that occurred in Iraq, in Iran in 1953. And then we also had the creation of the NSA, the National Security Agency, very heavily involved in signal intelligence. That's their main focus. They operate in the international arena. The NSA is not supposed to be intercepting communications between Americans here in the United States, even though there's been some controversy lately of conversations which are being intercepted and stored here in the United States between American citizens and foreigners overseas. And there's a picture of the NSA headquarters up in another technology-driven organization dealing with signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, which we now call GeoInt, and we'll talk about that later in collection. Imagery being photographs that could be your spy satellites, etc. Here's a good example of IMINT, which is now called GeoInt, again, and U-2, which was a spy plane developed post-World War II. I've actually included a little film clip here if you want to see what it's like to be in a U-2 flying at 75,000 feet. One of the famous incidents, I was a young man when this happened, and of course what we were doing is using these U-2s to fly over and take images of Soviet resources, the Soviet Union, and one of the most famous incidents that occurred was when Colonel Gary Francis Powers was shot down over Russia while flying a U-2, and that happened on May 1st, 1960. And of course that was a big propaganda deal that the Soviets made out of that. But the U-2 program would continue. I've seen that plane in person. It's very, very impressive. And at the time we called it IMINT, Imagery Intelligence, but that's now been replaced by GeoInt, G-E-O-I-N-T, Geospatial Intelligence. And both the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office have responsibility for the satellites, etc. So that just kind of changed its name. A very major event that occurred in 1961 was the Bay of Pigs invasion. There's some photographs of the invasion itself. Fidel Castro had led a communist revolution in 1959 which overthrew the Batista government, and a communist regime was set up. And then ultimately the United States entered into a plan whereby they would take they trained and sent former Cuban nationals to make a landing and then hopefully retake the island. It turned out to be a disaster for the United States and a tremendous embarrassment to the Jack Kennedy, who was the president at the time. And again, intelligence was very heavily involved in this endeavor. But of course, the decision ultimately is made by the President and his National Security Council as to whether to go forward or not. But the Bay of Pigs was a failure. The exiles, the Cuban exiles who made the landing there in Cuba, were either killed or they were captured. But the United States still continued to engage in what we call, it was a covert activity, secret operation. We still engage in covert activities against Cuba, but here we are this many years later, and Cuba is still a communist nation. At the time, it was heavily supported by the Soviet Union, but of course, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they've been on their own. And then later on, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in 1962, and where the Russians tried to put missiles in Cuba, which is only 90 miles off the coast of Miami. And you can see the value of intelligence here. We have imagery or GeoInt intelligence taking pictures of where the Russians were going to move ballistic missiles and create sites there in Cuba that would be 90 miles off our shore, a real threat. And what Kennedy did was they put a naval blockade around Cuba, and ultimately they resolved the crisis, and that actually turned out to be a political victory for the Kennedys, even though because Khrushchev ultimately backed down, they dismantled the missile sites and moved the missiles off the island. But you know, there's always compromise, and the United States, as a result, also had to give up some things. I believe what we ultimately did was we we moved some of our own missiles out of Turkey. But still, after the Bay of Pigs invasion and that failure, this was a win-win for the Kennedy administration. Vietnam, that was again, we're looking at containment, the domino effect, so to speak. North Vietnamese was a communist regime, and obviously the war in the South, South Vietnam, was a democratic government that was supported by the United States, and most of you are very familiar with this war. The CIA, the military, was involved in covert operations. Intelligence was a big part of it. For example, the CIA actually correctly predicted the Tet Offensive, which was a major offensive. Proved to be somewhat of a military disaster, but a public relations victory for the North. The politicians, in particular, and also, the CIA was involved in the removal of DM in 1963, who was the leader of South Vietnam, to place somebody that would be a little bit more friendly to the United States and their goals in this conflict. But eventually, the war just at its height, there was more than 500,000 U.S. troops deployed in Vietnam, and ultimately, America suffered more than 56,000 casualties. It became a very unpopular war, as many wars do become. But during this war, the CIA did have some positive things that occurred. They were much more accurate in their prediction of the strength of the North than some of the military authorities. But ultimately, once we pulled out, the South collapsed, and on April 30th, 1975, the Vietnamese entered Saigon and reunited the country of Vietnam under communist rule. There was also a lot of unrest at home. The picture there is the Weather Underground, which is was a domestic terrorist group that was involved in targeting ROTC buildings, police agencies, a very, very brutal group. But there were two events that did happen. There was COINTELPRO, which is an FBI operation that was gathering intelligence on the Communist Party, Black Panther Party, KKK, and other extremist groups here in the United States. And Operation Chaos, which was a CIA version of the same operation. Now, we know that the CIA is not supposed to be involved in spying domestically, and the FBI was engaged in operations spying on individuals in this country that involved, illegal wiretaps, that sort of thing. So these two programs created an atmosphere of mistrust of intelligence, which ultimately had a chilling effect, and also had a negative impact on the intelligence community later on in the 1970s and early 80s. They talk in the textbook about the Watergate on the next slide, about the Watergate Pike and Church committees. You had the famous Watergate burglary, which resulted in President Nixon having to resign. Congress was investigating the activities of the FBI and the CIA based on those two programs I just talked to you about, Operation Chaos and COINTELPRO, which they talk about at great length. Again, when you start spying on your own citizens, you better have a good reason to do it, and you better do it legally. Or ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to get caught as an organization, and some bad things are going to happen. And so ultimately what happened is there were some changes, and this is something we'll talk about later in this semester, to try to tighten up the methods and the legality of intelligence activities and the gathering of information on Americans in particular, and it resulted in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. And like I said, we will talk about this in greater length, but essentially the purpose of the FISA was to provide judicial oversight over the government surveillance of foreign individuals in the United States. So foreigners over here that we're spying on, but also be careful, make sure we're not spying on our own people. And so, and FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, also created a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court where you had judges that would accept applications. So in other words, when you're working in an espionage case, if you're an FBI agent back in those days, you would go to the FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, to get your warrants, your court orders, or whatever, to engage in to give you authorization, legal authorization, to either wiretap or conduct search warrants or whatever. But again, we'll get into this a little bit more in Chapter 10. Now, and also another reaction to the some of the problems of the late 60s and 70s, where you had spying on American citizens. When President Carter became president in 1977, he appointed a Navy Admiral Stansfield Turner as director of the CIA. And this guy had a technical background. He was much more in favor of signal intelligence and imagery and GEOINT over human intelligence, and they ended up eliminating over 800 positions from the agency. And I know for a fact this had a negative impact, because I interviewed a senior CIA official once, and he told me that was kind of the beginning of problems in the CIA during this administration. They lost a lot of their experience, and they got their budget cut. They lost a lot of capability at that time. And that would later carry on even up until 9/11, because the CIA really was their personnel had been cut. They didn't have a level of expertise that they needed, especially with the growing threat from terrorism after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let's look at this slide. Under President Carter, the HUMINT capability of the CIA was undermined. Reagan was a staunch anti-communist, so a lot of his effort was targeting the Soviet Union, and a lot of his policies ultimately led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. And he was active in the America. He supported the Mujahideen, the Holy Warriors, against the Soviets in the 1980s Afghan War. This became somewhat of a double-edged sword, because anybody that was fighting the Soviets during the Cold War, we would provide support through the CIA funding, weapons, etc. And so ultimately what happens is, when that war ends, then you have these Mujahideen. Many of them became members of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And then under President George H. Bush, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. And then we see the emergence of terrorism. And there's a picture of the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Beirut by Hezbollah, a terrorist organization based in Lebanon. You had the Pan Am 103 bombing, which was carried out by Libyan operatives. There's a picture of Osama bin Laden, of course, the founder of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, which means the base. And then the USS Cole, which was attacked in Yemen Harbor in 2000. So really what you're starting to see here in the 90s is the development of groups like Al-Qaeda coming out of that Afghan war, where a lot of the Mujahideen had received training, combat training, etc. And that was that double-edged sword that we're talking about. But we're now seeing where when the Soviet Union collapsed, you have this void, because now you only have one superpower. So now where does intelligence go? Where's their focus? Well, where that needed to be was on the rising and emergence of terrorism, which is a totally different type of war, so to speak, as compared to fighting a nation state like the Soviet Union. Then we have Master Spy Robert Hanssen, FBI agent, working the Russian desk. He was a Soviet specialist assigned to FBI headquarters, selling secrets to the Soviet Union I've got a film clip on him. Created, he was an FBI agent for 27 years. Access to very sensitive information, involved in espionage for 15 years. His motive was money, greed. He was estimated to have been paid $1.4 million in cash and diamonds to sell out his country. Known to expose 3 KGB agents working for the U.S. 2 were executed. Exposed interception techniques. He's now serving life in prison. There's a film on his spine called Breach. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's pretty well done and it's pretty interesting. Another master spy, Aldrich Ames. These are what we call moles or double agents. We think they're working for us, but at the same time they're spying for the Soviets. He was a CIA counterterrorism officer and analyst for Soviet intelligence operations. I've got a film clip on him I want you to watch. He compromised 100 intelligence operations, caused the death of 9 undercover agents, got paid $2.5 million. He's considered to be a sociopath. He actually passed 2 polygraph examinations. The FBI ultimately solved his case, even though their initial target they thought was another agent. But that's the danger, and that's why, as we talked about in Chapter 1, counterintelligence methods have to be very, very aggressive and try to identify potential moles within our own agencies. These are just a couple of other individuals that have been involved in treason against the United States: Earl Pitts and Brian Reagan. That was just something, this memory test slide is just something I used for the lecture class. During the Clinton years, President Clinton actually reduced the U.S. intelligence budget by 20%, which turned out to be not very good considering that terrorism was growing during this time period. We had the first World Trade Center attack in 1993, led by Ramzi Youssef. 1998, the East African Embassy attacks in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, carried out by Al-Qaeda operatives. 1995, we had the Oklahoma City bombing, which was Tim McVeigh, an American. Of course, I've talked about it briefly. 2000, we had the U.S. coal bombing in Yemen Harbor, which killed a bunch of Navy sailors, carried out by Al-Qaeda operatives. And also during this time period, you had Somalia, issues with Rwanda, Bosnia, and Kosovo. I actually worked in Kosovo shortly after the bombing there. Very interesting experience. And when I say bombing, I mean the movement of Allied forces in there. UN forces include primarily the United States, Great Britain, to oust the Serbs out of Kosovo, Milosevic and his people. And of course, 9/11 and its aftermath, we'll spend a lot of time referring back to that. 9/11 was an intelligence failure. We had reduced our capabilities the 20 years prior to that. We had not really recognized the scope and threat from Islamic terrorists and international terrorists. We had the 9/11 Commission came up with great ideas on how to respond now that we had been hit, and many of the ideas and recommendations that they promoted were actually placed into law. Creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the passing of the Patriot Act. We also had the Intelligence Reform and Prevention Act, creation of the Director of National Intelligence position, which I talked about before. But we also had some failures, and if you look at, this is something we'll talk about later as well, if you look about the intelligence community was wrong about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. They were led aside by that individual called Curveball, who was an informant that actually lied to them about the presence of a biological weapon program in Iraq. As we look at Chapter 3, we'll take a look at our objectives real quick, explain the organization of the U.S. intelligence community, including the role of federal, local, state, and private agencies, explain why the U.S. intelligence community has evolved to its current state, what is extraordinary rendition, describe how the 9/11 Commission impacted the IC or the intelligence community today, describe the role played by the Director of National Intelligence and why such a position was deemed necessary, and let's look at the identity of the 16 agencies. If you'll notice, I've uploaded, or you'll see it in one of the slides, the actually intelligence community as it exists today. Director of National Intelligence currently is Mr. Clapper, appointed by the President. He's the Principal Intelligence Advisor to the President and National Security Council. He has access to all the intelligence and responsible for the coordination of all national intelligence and foreign, domestic, and homeland security. He's an overseer only. He's not head of it. I mean, he doesn't have people working for him that are doing collection and analysis. He's a coordinator. And of course, this was one of the recommendations by the 9/11 Commission because of the lack of coordination of information and intelligence between agencies prior to 9/11. National Security Council, this is the President and Vice President. You have the Secretaries of State, Defense, Treasury, Assistant to the President for National Security, the DNI, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Chief of Staff to the President. These are the fellows and ladies that are making the strategic decisions based on the intelligence provided them. And there's others as needed. If the Attorney General needs to be there, he would be invited, or if other agency heads, FBI director, whatever. There's our intelligence community. I'm not going to read all the names, but you can go through, make sure you're familiar with them. Also, don't forget, local and state agencies also have their own intelligence agencies and capabilities. Intelligence is something that's needed at every level of government. This slide, what we see is the National Counterterrorism Center. This is something that was also an organization that was also developed after the 9/11 attacks and as a result of the 9/11 Commission recommendations. They would also be stovepiped up to where their boss would be the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. In the National Counterterrorism Center, all the intelligence communities and law enforcement organizations have a seat there. And this is a kind of like a depository of different flows of intelligence that comes in from the different intelligence agencies into this organization, where it can be collated and analyzed further, looking for trends, etc. A great idea. Normally you'll have somebody like an FBI agent who manages this. I think they rotate it, is what I've been told, between the FBI, CIA, and other major stakeholders that have seats at the table. So all the members of the intelligence community and law enforcement community and the military would have representation at this NCTC. It's located in Northern Virginia, just outside of D.C. What's the Joint Terrorism Task Force? That's a little bit different than the National Counterterrorism Center. That's actually, we have them here in North Carolina. It's an operational unit led by the FBI, where you'll have members of the different federal, state, and local investigative agencies with representation. And their job, of course, would be doing the operational investigation of terrorist cells. They would also have some intel capability. But let's look at what if the National Counterterrorism Center develops intelligence that says that there's an operational cell of Hamas terrorists in North Carolina. That would be referred down to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and they would do the investigation of that suspected cell. So they would actually be out there doing the surveillance and making the arrests and developing evidence, etc. Fusion centers are more of a state intelligence center, where you have state and local agencies that exchange intelligence information. They're supported by the federal government, FBI, Department of Homeland Security. They get a lot of their funding, And in these fusion centers, you would have state police, you would have Raleigh Police Department, depending on where it's located, and they would have intelligence capability where they could exchange information on terrorism, on drug investigations, and that sort of thing. This slide is strictly a depiction of the task organization of the Department of Homeland Security. And you'll see TSA, Border, Customs and Border Protection, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the other various agencies that comprise the Department of Homeland Security. Very, very large organization. You'll know what's not a member of it. It's not the CIA is not a member of Homeland Security. The FBI is not a member of Homeland Security. The FBI is part of the Department of Justice. The CIA is an independent agency which reports to the DNI and up through the President. Within the different agencies like the CIA, etc., and the FBI, they also have their various intelligence collection and analysis organizations within the parent organization. Department of Homeland Security really doesn't have, if you look at it, its task organization. It has an intelligence and an analyst undersecretary and branch, but it doesn't have the capability, say, of the CIA or even the FBI as far as the number of resources engaged. They are heavily involved in the fusion centers, though, not only from a financing or a budgetary reason, but also a representative. So they can use those fusion centers also to develop information to pass on to Homeland Security. But with the National Counterterrorism Center, this information should be shared. If there's information that is developed that becomes intelligence from the FBI that impacts Homeland Security, then that should be passed along. And if you go back, if you do our reading there, you'll see one other reason that there was a problem with the 9/11 attack. The fact, not that even if the intelligence agencies would have been working at full capacity and capability and sharing information, that it would have prevented. But I think if that happened today, that there would be a much greater chance that they would have picked up on these Mideasterners coming in to our country, taking flight training lessons. Some of them didn't even want to know how to land. This type of intelligence, I think, would have been more readily passed along and had been much more sharing. And yes, you're always going to have rivalries. The FBI and the CIA were a rivalry. State Department and CIA, Department of Defense and CIA. Some of these things will continue, but legislation and the moves that have been made since 9/11 have reduced a lot of those barriers. Remember, Congress controls the money for these organizations. One of the most famous, obviously, covert operations was Operation Neptune Spear. CIA actually led the overall intelligence effort, developing the information that led to the location of Osama bin Laden. You had the National Reconnaissance Organization, the Geospatial, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence provided collaboration. Military intel agencies contributed. All of this. This would be what we would call an all-source intelligence effort. A lot of different sources of intelligence came in to collaborate in the final product, which ultimately resulted in SEAL Team 6 and JSOC, which is the Joint Special Operations Command, conducting a successful raid and eliminating Osama bin Laden in that raid. Just some things. Make sure that when you look through this chapter that you also read about the DEA is obviously heavily involved in narcotics investigations and the relationship between narco-terrorism and individuals involved in narcotic distribution. And most of the larger agencies, DEA, Department of Justice, Department of State, they all have their own intelligence capabilities along with the military. Interestingly, this would be a good question. What member of the intelligence community comprises or takes most of the budget for intelligence? And it's actually the military. They control about as high as 80% of the budget. Of course, with your National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, you're looking at cartography, map making, imagery intelligence. The NSA is the one that's involved in signal intelligence. So, and of course, the state and local play a large role. That's that multiplier effect. We have 700,000 state and local police officers. Those are the eyes and ears of national security. They also talk about intelligence having a lot to do with policing today. Intelligence-led policing is a model whereby the intelligence department within an agency or department develops intelligence that tells where your most serious crimes are, and that intelligence actually leads the investigative effort from patrol to investigations. Very, very important principle. I saw that myself when I was a federal agent. And I've already talked about fusion centers, and remember the private sector also plays a key role in intelligence. Let's look at some possible questions